Okay, class, we're going to continue on our discussion here of cellular respiration by looking at where we've got at this point, and we're going to be able to move on to oxidative phosphorylation next. What we've discussed up to this point is the fact that the glucose molecule has been completely oxidized. There's no physical remains of it anymore. CO2 and H2O were produced in glycolysis, the prep reaction, and in the citric acid cycle. And remember going forward that glycolysis and citric acid cycle are not high energy producing stages. They are the stages designed to oxidize the glucose molecule and also to produce the high energy electron carriers NADH and FADH2. Both of these electron carriers are energy rich molecules because their electrons have a high potential energy, or what's called a redox potential. And you look down at the bottom here and you can see oxidative phosphorylation, which is what we're going to talk about last here, 32 to 34 ATPs. This is the stage of cellular respiration where the majority of energy, or ATP, is produced in this process. So we're going to move on in our discussion and look a little bit further at oxidative phosphorylation. And one thing to remember is up to this point, we have not really discussed the role of the oxygen as a reactant in this equation. And at this point, hence the name oxidative phosphorylation, we are going to look at what role oxygen plays in the process. Okay? And so oxidative phosphorylation, a couple things to remember. The citric acid cycle that we had previously discussed, that happens in the matrix. Okay? The oxidative phosphorylation involves the electron transport chain, okay, which the electron transport chain occurs along this inner mitochondrial membrane. And the fact that the mitochondria has a double membrane is very important to recognize, and we'll show why that is here in just a second. But the NADH and the FADH, the electron carriers that we have discussed, their role, again, is to bring high energy electrons and hydrogen ions to the electron transport chain. And then the oxidative phosphorylation, okay, essentially translates to creating ATP in the presence of oxygen. Okay? Phosphorylation. Phosphorylation means adding another phosphate to ADP to produce ATP. So here is a diagram of the electron transport chain where NADH and FADH are transporting their high energy electrons and their hydrogen ions. So a couple things to note here. NAD, you can see here, this is the reduced form of NADH with its high energy electrons and its hydrogen ions. And then you also see that FADH, which comes from one stage in the citric acid cycle, also delivers its high energy electrons and hydrogen ions, but at a different location in the electron transport chain. And since we are discussing oxidative phosphorylation, I will point out, you'll see there, right? Oxygen is showing up here at the end of the electron transport chain. Oxygen has a vital role in this process. I'll show you another diagram here. Here's another location where oxygen is discussed here. And so now that we're at the last stage of cellular respiration, you want to recognize that there's a variety of things that are happening at the same time here in order to produce ATP. The first thing that is happening is the NADH, right, which is a reduced form, is delivering its electrons and its hydrogen ions from glycolysis, the prep reactions, and from the citric acid cycle. Now, FADH, as I had mentioned, FADH2 is just coming from that one stage in the citric acid cycle, but either way, it's still delivering its high energy electrons and its hydrogen ions. And the majority of what is happening here are these stages. Like I said, many things happening at once. First thing, as the electrons get delivered here to the electron transport chain, they have a high potential energy, analogous to a rock at the top of a hill. Okay? And as a rock falls down a hill, it gives off energy, and that energy has to be coupled. A similar thing is happening in the electron transport chain. The electrons are passed. You have membrane-bound carriers. You can see here, these are embedded in the phospholipid bilayer. Then you also have what are called mobile carriers, the Q complex and the cytochrome C. And their job is to basically shuttle electrons back and forth that have been delivered from NADH and FADH. And as these electrons are passed from carrier to carrier, they give off energy. This energy has to be coupled to the next step, which is what's happening, is these hydrogen ions that are also present. You see here the intermembrane space, okay, going back here, right? The intermembrane space between the inner membrane and the outer membrane is what we're discussing. Okay? And this intermembrane space is basically concentrated with hydrogen ions. Our goal is to keep this space continuously concentrated with hydrogen ions. An analogy is like having a dam keeping water behind a dam so that you can keep the hydroelectric rotors and turbines spinning to produce electricity. We want to keep this space with high hydrogen ions concentration. The problem here is that the hydrogen ions are highly concentrated here in the intermembrane space, and they have a lower concentration in the matrix. So based upon our studies of active transport and diffusion, right, we see that we're going to have to use energy to get these hydrogens from the matrix to the intermembrane space. This is where the energy comes from, is as the electrons pass from membranes and mobile carriers, the electrons give off energy. This energy has to be immediately coupled into the pumping of hydrogens from a low concentration to a high concentration. Again, we have to keep that intermembrane space filled with hydrogen ions. Okay? And as you can see here, we've learned in our chemistry, all like charges repel. Okay? So all of these hydrogen ions, when they're coming into contact with one another, are repelling. So you've got an incredible internal force happening here. And what's happening is these hydrogen ions, if you can imagine, they're repelling one another, pushing each other away, trying to get further away from one another. Okay? And eventually, what happens is these hydrogen ions, okay, will find one location where they will be able to pass back through the membrane to go from a high to a low concentration. And that is through what's called the ATP synthase complex, right? And ATP synthase, hence the name, is an enzyme that produces ATP. And this comes back to our discussion here to summarize, called oxidative phosphorylation. So I had discussed earlier that oxidative phosphorylation is essentially the production of ATP through and in the presence of oxygen. So here we see our oxygen again. So to summarize our oxidative phosphorylation, NAD and NADH, the reduced form, will deliver its high energy electrons and its hydrogen ions. FAD will also deliver those from the cycles before. As the electrons are high, they have a high potential energy at the beginning of the chain. As they fall down the chain, they give off energy. This energy is used to pump hydrogen ions from a low concentration in the matrix to a high concentration in the intermembrane space. The role of oxygen here is a couple things. One of them, oxygen has a high affinity for electrons. Okay? High affinity for electrons. Oxygen will pull these electrons down, help pull these down. Energy, ATP, will be produced as this ATP synthase spins. And as you can see here, these hydrogens, as they pass back through, if oxygen was not available, the matrix would be very acidic, much like the intermembrane spaces. But because of the process of the presence of oxygen, you can create a chemical bond here with the hydrogens and the oxygens to produce neutral water. And this is the mechanism involved in oxidative phosphorylation.